Let's move on to talk about the arrest of Nicola Sturgeon. She's not been charged with anything, but she was questioned for several hours about the SNP party finances scandal. I mean, in a sense, we've known this has been coming for a long time. She was one of the 3 people named on the party's finances, but it is still a massive shock for a former first minister, probably the most, the longest serving first minister in Scotland, one of the most significant figures of her generation, to be arrested.
It's incredible. It's also incredible. This is the third piece on our agenda today because of how much has actually gone on this week. But no, I mean, it's incredibly striking. I mean, I wrote a piece this week about Partygate and about Nicola Sturgeon and how, whilst there's not very much we can talk about this particular case because of these incredibly stringent contempt of court laws, which we might get into, the fact that you do have the former leader of the SNP, this kind of fated figure, particularly by kind of centrist liberals for so long, always held up as the kind of antithesis of Boris Johnson being arrested and then released as part of this investigation into finances, party finances. Meanwhile, the final act of Boris Johnson and the cake is finally bearing out. You do have to wonder what was probably the bigger scandal in the end. But yes, I mean, beyond the case that we can't talk about, what a spectacular fall from grace. I think that's fair to say, regardless of what the outcome of the investigation actually is. And also, I think one thing that is worth saying is just how chilling it is that it's impossible to talk about it, how fascinating it would be to see the commentary and the public debate and where public opinion would be and the sorts of things people would be saying if we were legally entitled and able to talk about this. But because of the fact that the Scottish interpretation of contempt of court laws are such that they don't trust jurors to be able to be exposed to any kind of public debate about any of this, and even before someone is charged, means that we're not able to have that. So it's almost like it's taking place in a bizarre kind of parallel universe where you're not actually able to touch it.
And to be clear to our viewers and listeners, if we were to venture an opinion on the case, particularly on a matter of her innocence or guilt potentially, we could go to prison. So that's why you've ended up with, if anyone's been reading the coverage of it, it's all very, straight down the line, very factual, very muted, which is a real shame because, this is a serious issue that needs to be debated in full. Matt, like one of the other things, it wasn't just the party finances scandal that brought Nicola Sturgeon down. She also was probably one of the wokest leaders in the West, particularly the gender recognition bill, was almost like the final thing, the final nail in the coffin. I mean, what did you make of that kind of period towards the end of her premiership?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very interesting. I mean, just on the gender recognition reform bill, I think that's a really nice example of when radical progressives push policies which reflect the ideology that they hold, but which really alienate much of the rest of the country. I mean, if you looked at the underlying idea for that piece of legislation, which is we should allow 16-year-olds to legally change their gender without medical supervision, and in a very quick period of time, very short period of time. I polled that and found only 20% of voters were supportive of it, and other pollsters found very similar things, which is basically telling us that on a lot of issues, and I've just done a load of other polling on should we allow trans athletes to compete in women's sports, should we allow trans students to access girls' bathrooms in schools or universities and so on. These are basically very unpopular policies. But what's happening is you've got a radical activist minority embedded in certain parties, embedded in certain countries that are basically imposing these policies from above. And the silent majority feels as though, on the one hand, it's appalled by what's happening, but it has no real outlet for that. And I think you saw that really in Scotland, and you see it across Britain, to be honest. None of the mainstream parties are anti-woke, right? Basically, none of them are vigorously, consistently hostile and opposed to radical progressivism. None of them, not even the Conservative Party. And so many voters, I think, for understandable reasons, are quite scared to put their head above the parapet and say, actually, I'm not really down with this. And you also saw it, by the way, this week in mid-June 2023, when Gallup have just come out in the US and they've shown that support for trans athletes competing in women's-only sports has declined sharply. The British Social Attitude Survey found the same. So the argument is actually being lost by the radical progressives. They're losing public support, but even still, politicians feel unable to step up and give that voice and to represent that in politics. And I think just the other thing about Scotland that I find interesting is, and I wrote about this in the Sunday Times a month or so ago, which is that if you take what's happening in Scotland as a whole, I think it really just points to the problems of really what happens with one-party dominance. When you have one party dominating the political system, and there were bizarre features in Scotland around, a wife-husband team essentially running the incumbent party, which was, nobody really picked up on that as being a unique, if not bizarre, feature of Scottish politics, but it was. And also, I think for many voters, they'll be looking at all of the events in Scotland with a real sense that this is just deeply hypocritical. On the one hand, we've had a party, a sort of cohort of politicians that have lectured the rest of the country about morality and behaviour in public office. And then on the other hand, there's a series of reports and stories in the press concerning, what will appear to many voters to be morally questionable behaviour. And I think that goes to show that many of the people who perhaps have claimed to be more morally worthy, more morally righteous than the rest of the political class often are no such thing at all.
And finally, Tom, Humza Yousaf, perhaps his flailing around, is itself an indication of just how dominant Sturgeon and her family were at the top of Scottish politics.
Yeah, Humza Yousaf, he makes Boris Johnson look like one of history's great statesmen, doesn't he, in terms of how he's actually handling all of this. Even this week, apparently he was telling MPs not to call on Nicola Sturgeon to be expelled from the party or suspended from the party, I should say. So reliant is he on Sturgeon's legacy? It's the only reason that he's actually there, despite the fact that he's such a bungler and has failed in every single ministerial brief he's ever been given. It is striking, though, just thinking back to the original collapse of Nicola Sturgeon's government over this gender recognition issue. I feel like that really for me, sealed the debate that's been raging for some time, which is how important is this woke stuff really?
Yeah.
It's not really something which dominates certainly electoral politics. And yet here you had a political leader and a political party whose alleged project is to break up the United Kingdom. It's to get Scotland out of the Union. And yet she burnt the whole house down because she was convinced of this idea that there is no such thing as biological sex, and that letting people in possession of a penis into a women's prison is probably not a big deal. That, if anything, is going to put to bed this idea that this has not become the kind of ideology of the sort of left technocratic ruling class, if you like, then surely it's Nicola Sturgeon, who in the space of what feels like no time at all has gone from being someone who dominated the Scottish political scene, who was fated certainly south of the border, probably even more so than north of the border, who was seen really as an embodiment of all that was kindly and wonderful about a certain type of politics, but has had this spectacular fall from grace because the voters noticed what the commentators didn't, which is that far from being progressive and cuddly and liberal and so on, this is a very strange and a very damaging ideology which has taken hold. And hopefully, you would think, she serves as a cautionary tale to others, but I dare say she won't, at least where the elite are concerned.